Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes your brain just seems to switch gears, performing better or worse depending on what happened just moments before? Well, this new study dives deep into how our brains learn and adapt, especially in tricky situations like the Stroop task. And it has some fascinating clues. Think about it like this. You are trying to do something, and what happened a second ago can completely change how you do it now. Scientists are super interested in these little moments of adaptation. They want to understand how our brains are constantly fine-tuning our actions, especially when things get challenging. They use cool tests like the Stroop task, where you see a word like red, but it is written in blue ink. And you have to say the ink color, not read the word. It's a classic way to study how we control our impulses. Normally, researchers try to figure out these effects by looking at what happened on the last few trials. But the thing is, these adaptations don't just happen on one trial, they can unfold over many. This makes it hard to get a clear picture, especially when a few different things are happening at once. That is where this research team has come up with a really clever approach. They're using a type of modeling that looks at how our brains accumulate information over time. It's like building a dynamic step-by-step picture of what's going on inside your head. Instead of just looking at simple patterns, they've created a sophisticated model that tries to capture all these different learning and adaptation processes simultaneously. They test this by first looking at a simpler task called the color word contingency learning task. In this task, words are paired with colors, but the words don't mean colors. The main idea is that some color, word pairings happen more often than others, and people tend to get faster with the pairings that happen more often. The scientists are essentially trying to build a detailed map of how our brains learn from experience. They found that even in this simpler task, there is a lot going on. It is not just about how often things happen. It is also about remembering recent pairings, and even whether the same colors or words show up repeatedly. They identified a few key players first. There is contingency learning itself, where you get faster with more frequent pairings. Then there is also a kind of memory retrieval, where you might recall the last time you saw a specific word-color combination. They even found something called signaling, where if the entire stimulus repeats, you can be super fast. This suggests our brains are always looking for shortcuts. After they had a good handle on these factors in the simpler task, they moved on to the more complex Stroop task. In the Stroop task, they identified two main types of conflict adaptation. One is called the congruency sequence effect, or CSE. This is what happens when you perform better after you've just encountered a difficult conflicting trial. It is like your brain says, "Whoa, that was hard. Let me ramp up my focus for the next one." The other is item-specific proportion congruency, or ISPC. This is where you learn to adjust your control based on specific items, like if a particular word is usually in an incongruent color. The really crucial part here is that the scientists realized that the simpler learning processes they saw in the contingency task could actually mimic these conflict adaptation effects. This is a big deal because it means that researchers might sometimes mistake contingency learning for actual conflict adaptation. Their advanced model allows them to untangle these things. They built an even more complex model that included these conflict-related elements. After testing this model, they found something really interesting. They found strong evidence for item-specific conflict adaptation that was specifically linked to dealing with incongruent trials. This means that the brain is learning to anticipate and manage conflict for particular stimulus combinations. This item-specific adaptation seemed to be pretty robust, even when the experiments were designed to minimize those confounding learning effects. This suggests that our brains are really good at learning specific patterns of conflict and adjusting accordingly. They also looked at sequential conflict adaptation, which is that ramping up of control after a difficult trial. They found that this kind of adaptation was present, but it was easily confused by the simpler contingency learning effects, especially in experiments where they hadn't carefully controlled for all those potential confounds. The scientists used this powerful modeling approach, combined with something called posterior predictive checking, to really dig into the data. Posterior predictive checking is like asking the model to generate new data based on its findings, and then comparing that to the real data. If the model's generated data looks a lot like the real data, it means the model is capturing the underlying processes well. What does this all mean for us? Well, it highlights how our brains are constantly learning and adapting, not just to general difficulty, but to very specific patterns of challenges. It also shows us how easy it can be to misinterpret these effects. If we're not careful, what looks like strategic control might actually be a learned association. The study's strength lies in its sophisticated modeling approach that can tease apart these different processes. By using a generative model and rigorous checks, they can be much more confident that they're actually measuring conflict adaptation and not just some other learning effect. However, like all research, this study has its limitations. The authors point out that when experiments aren't perfectly designed to eliminate all those confounding factors, it can be really hard to be sure about the exact nature of the conflict adaptation. Also, they mentioned that something called list-wide proportion congruency effects were too complex to model with their current framework, suggesting that different timescales of adaptation might be at play. Looking ahead, this kind of detailed modeling opens up tons of possibilities. It can help us understand individual differences in how people handle conflict, and even how these processes interact with other cognitive functions like task switching. It also emphasizes the need for well-designed experiments in the first place. So, the big takeaway is that our brains are incredibly dynamic learners. What seems like a simple reaction to a difficult task might actually be a complex interplay of learned associations, memory retrieval, and true strategic control. This research provides a powerful new tool for psychologists to map out these intricate processes, helping us understand not just how we deal with challenges, but how we learn and adapt in countless everyday situations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the science of the mind, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more insightful breakdowns of the latest research. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.